Future Hacker. Life. Path. Future.
Welcome back, everybody. This is Future Hacker. I'm your host, Maria Taiji, and we're talking to Rasmus Rasmusson. We talked about how it is to be an entrepreneur in China on the first episode, as well as his startup Worm and how he pivoted his business after, COVID happened. So let's move on and talk a little bit about, technologies and the market and anything that is new out there. So Rasmus, what are the main trends for IoT now that we have this very promising market with the spread of 5G in the world? And specifically, do you see artificial intelligence apply in IoT? And do you have some use cases to share with us?
So for IoT, I think the main trend, I think, is that it's approaching the time when it's going to be meaningful. You're going to see meaningful IoT products because so far we're still early days. It's a lot of very bad solutions out on the market. And I recognize that from having worked in the previous two internet eras, or advents of the previous two internet eras, first of the PC in the 90s and then the mobile in the early 2000s. And so where I think, if we think about the mobile world, we're somewhere 2003. And in 2007 is, of course, when iPhone was released, and that's when the smartphones really took off. But before that, they were really struggling. The products were really about a very poor version of laptops. If you remember the early, like not Samsung, but Blackberries and all that, they had like tiny little hardware keyboard that were sort of a miniaturized version of a laptop, because that is the extent of what people could imagine. And in the 90s, I worked a lot with websites for a while as a consultant before I started this conference system. Then we did like for newspapers, and they constantly wanted to have them in PDF so you can print them out and read them on paper. So people have said the majority of the products that come out are interpretation. It's like they just continue the previous trend. So now we see that. There's like in the IoT world, everything is like mobile, remote control the lamp, remote control your oven, which is idiotic. Because the new era is sort of a Harry Potter world. That's what IoT is. Like every object has its own life. And so 5G will tremendously help with that because it will make it easier to install primarily. I think it will be too expensive in the beginning. After that, it will come much cheaper soft SIMs that you will just be able to very easily have an object that's any electrical device that would just connect straight to the mobile network. That would be fantastic. But that's a few years away because I think 5G will be too expensive in the beginning and Wi-Fi will still be better. The AI is incredibly overrated. This is the worst buzzword I know. I appreciate AI a lot, but really it's algorithms, and it's more advanced algorithms. That's really what it is. So I think most businesses claim to use AI, but they're not using AI at all. I think it's really useful. I think it will be very useful eventually, but most businesses still haven't really figured out how to use it. And the way we will use it is to make what we call cooking programs in our ovens cheaper to make. So we will feed our system with manually made cooking programs, and then through algorithms mostly, it's not even necessarily AI, it will just create a bunch of new cooking programs or machine recipes. There it's helpful. I don't think AI is actually going to be that big in the next few years. I mean, in 20 years or 30 years. But for now, it feels like a buzzword for most businesses, I should say.
Talking about this hyper-connected future, do you think the advancements of cybersecurity will be able to follow the speed of innovation and keep us protected?
Here we know that's not going to happen because we can also look at internet history. And I can relate to that because, when I work on products for the past 22, 3 years, whatever I've been in this industry, it's the last thing you want to spend money on. Like, why would we spend on security for a threat that doesn't exist? So clearly there will be, especially in the IoT world, you're going to see some evil viruses that fires up every oven in the world. And then there will be legal actions and there will be disasters and things. I mean, there's going to be a lot of really bad things happening before it gets safe. And we see that with baby monitor, for example. I read an article with someone who just sort of monitored a baby monitor to see how often it gets hacked. And it was hacked like 10 times per day. It was insane because the security is so poorly. So we have, in my company, we started building our oven on a common framework. And then we started thinking this we had these nightmares, or I did. Someone's going to hack our oven and fire them up and peek into people's homes and so on. So we decided, just take out anything that's standard. So we built our own OS in C from scratch, like an insane thing to do. But it was just security. So I think, no, unfortunately, there's going to be a lot of very bad things happening before it gets good. And because of that reason, when you have little money, why spend it on a threat that is just theoretical until it's no longer theoretical?
Exactly. But, it's great to know that since the beginning you thought about that. And it seems to me that it's just going to be this race against whatever craziness is going to happen out there. And then we're going to sort out on the go what will have to be done, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is exactly what happened with PC. It happened with everything. Like, you can see social networks now. It's not really security, but it's fake news coming out because they discovered vulnerability. So, I ran a social network for a while, and it's sort of, you're naive. You think you're creating these, if they like this, then they like that. And then you don't realize that you actually created a system for feeding people with disinformation. So I think it's not necessarily just hacking, but it's also those flaws with the early technology that you didn't use your imagination enough to realize what's going to happen. And so I think we will see that for sure with that. Things are going to get connected and people are going to use it. So
you have a very interesting view, and now I'm completely changing the subject, okay, guys? But you do have a very interesting view of how the future of food delivery will look like. The reason we actually got into this subject is we were talking about how the market works in China and why he got into the oven idea. So it's not that outside of the topic, but just so the listeners get a background from that. And then you started talking to me about this whole new concept of future of food. So can please you walk us through what you think this segment will look like in the next 20 to 30 years?
Sure, absolutely. My favorite topic. So here I feel pretty convinced what's going to happen. With food, I really have worked on it a lot, and I thought about it a lot, and I've talked to the biggest food companies in the world and chefs, and I feel like this is what's going to happen. What we see in China is what we see everywhere, is that food delivery and meal delivery has increased a lot, and people in China basically live of it. I mean, millennials especially, they just order all the time. And the delivery is so fast and so cheap in China that you can get within half an hour, you get your food. I accidentally ordered one small French fries once from McDonald's coming at 1 a.m. So you can do that. But the flip side and downside of food delivery is that the food is usually old. So half an hour is very fast, but usually it's up to an hour. And in a restaurant, you would not eat food that has been cooked an hour. In fact, it's unhealthy because they keep the food in what's called a danger zone, which is between 4 and 55 degrees. Bacteria loves to multiply. And so people who are sensitive to viruses and bacteria, they eat food that was running around town for 50 minutes. And that's how people get food poisoning. Because it's food poisoning, even if the chef doesn't clean his or her hands properly, if you eat it right away, there's so little bacteria that your body's going to fight it off. But if it grows for 50 minutes, that's not going to be so easy. So that's one side. Plus the quality is very bad. There's very few things that travel well. So that's the need. So how to solve that? Well, one solution is to do what most sort of high-end restaurants do. And that means that they par-cook the food. They prepare it, so they cook it to 80%. And then they blast freeze it or blast chill it. When you're going to eat it, you do the remaining 20%, which is very fast. And so you get a freshly cooked meal instead of a reheated meal or a meal that was kept warm, which makes it fresh. It's like a newly cooked meal. So that's what you want. And that means that the meal delivery companies can ship cold food, which significantly improves their business because they can ship it a few times a week. People just eat the same thing over and over again. So you can, after having been a customer to a meal delivery company, you can say, you always buy these 3 dishes. Why don't you buy 2 at this time? You get 50% discount or something. So they cut their delivery costs. So there's an incentive for the meal delivery companies to ship cold food. Food industry, the mighty food industry that hasn't figured out how to get into the meal delivery industry, they can now start shipping par-cooked food because that's what they're good at. I mean, if you think about these Nestle and Unilever and so on, they usually cook ready-made food, but it's a small alteration and now they can make par-cooked food. Now, the missing component here are ovens or other heating devices that can take a very precise instruction from the food company. So imagine now that Nestle makes a par-cooked meal and they ship it via a meal delivery company because you want it right now. And the meal delivery company is around the corner. They don't have to go to the restaurant and pick it up because they just pick it from the local freezer or fridge that they have. So they can ship it in 15 or 20 minutes. Now you come to your home. Now, if you just have an old oven, it's not going to heat well, and it's not going to know how to finish the last 20% because it has to be so precise. So here you need a cloud-connected oven or something similar that can take extremely precise and cook. So you need a combination of steam and heat and whatnot. And that's what we have done. So obviously I'm a fan of this idea. So in other words, I think in 20 years, when you eat food at home, you will primarily be eating par-cooked and par-baked food that is frozen, dried, or in your fridge, and then you put it in, and it has a barcode or an RFID tag on it or something. And the machine that you prepare it in will know, without you having to read any instructions, what it is, and will just cook it from a predefined recipe that was designed by the same company that made a dish, and you will get the most perfect meal.
That's a pretty great idea. That's actually the first time I hear, and it just makes so much sense. I think that the only problem now is every time that I order food from delivery, I'm going to be thinking about everything you said about the whole bacteria in action. So I hope I forget that. And let's move on. So, when you were working on your project, you realized how hard it is to put a small batch of a complex product to be produced and tested in the market. So basically, you have this amazing, innovative idea, but, somehow needs to make a prototype to test the market, to get it out there. But, you have to produce it and getting it assembled without the proper resources in place. At the same time that you can't really invest into a factory from scratch just to test it. It's all a challenge. And then you came up with this new business, which is a coworking for factories, which it sounds pretty cool, really. This is just another great story that I love that, you share with us.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's called The Works. LE.works is our address if anyone wants to check us out. It's the world's first co-factory. Though people claim that there are co-factories, whenever we look at it, it's not a co-factory. So basically, the background to this is that when I wanted to build our oven, I ran into large factories that could make it, but first of all, they thought our batch sizes were too small. So even though they would take the order, they would still, you felt like you're not going to be very important in their role. And the second is that many of these factories, they have their own product line. So when you see how the smart oven companies, they often go to actual oven makers that have their own product line that will disassemble your product and look at it with their R&D team. That's what they have to do in order to make it, right? But at the same time, how am I going to stop them from taking some of those solutions and putting in their own product? I was really uncomfortable with these big factories with my product. And then we went to small factories. The small factories didn't understand our product. Small factories are just good at one thing usually, and they certainly don't understand a complicated IoT product. So then I thought this isn't going to be quality. Instead, I thought, well, since we understand assembly, we've designed this product, our engineers can at least do the assembly. I mean, sourcing the parts is fine. So you can get like a plastics factory delivers. They're very good at delivering a good plastic product, or an electronics factory can do that. But the assembly is what's troubling. But our engineers know the assembly. So why don't we just get our own factory? We started researching, but it's so much effort to do that, to handle all like staffing and sign long leases and so on. But then I had run into other startups, but also established companies who said, well, if you actually go ahead with that, give us a call, because we also would like that level of control and we want the privacy, etc. So I thought, man, maybe we can just centralize, share the factory management, so that each of us can just focus on our own production line and decide exactly how we want it, but someone else just handles the staff and handle the equipment and so on. So that was the background to it. And last year I had been touring around, as you do in China as an entrepreneur, and meet different startup competitions and such. And I talked to lots of sort of government about this idea, and everyone was very positive, and some of our investors were very positive. So then I decided to start this end of last year. So now we just opened our factory. It's being built. It's done this week. So now I run 2 startups.
That was such a great idea, and I hope we can help in getting the word out there. And it's happening this week. So, wish you loads of success in this endeavor. And, a great trend for this field, when talking about factories, is the dissemination of the use of augmented reality and virtual reality in prototyping your product, before actually getting it to production and assembly, and equipment maintenance, training of personnel, and there's all those usages that you can do when it comes to manufacturing as well. So do you see those technologies already in use in factories in China? And how long do you think it will take the market for a broader adoption?
No, I don't see it yet. When you see pictures from factories, they're always like super cool factories, like robotics, and it looks fantastic, right? But the reality is that they don't look like that. It's people sitting on plastic chairs. It's very manual, especially assembly. Even Foxconn that makes Apple products have been, until very recently, heavily manual. But that's because assembly, robots are still not very good at assembly. So I think you still look at lots of staff for a foreseeable future, and especially electronic assembly. That also means that it's kind of low tech. I know lots of factory owners, or not lots, but I know some, and they are kind of old school. They don't understand technology at all. And they certainly won't invest in this kind of technology, augmented reality. I think the first thing they invest in now is the software to improve the production line. So they basically have screens above every manufacturing worker, assembly worker, their productivity level, and they can signal when they're done with a step, and then you can feed that into the cloud reporting, and you can improve that. That's really where the most IT investment is happening, to improve the production line. And the other part is, of course, the supply, that you want to source, keep better track of your parts and your warehouse and your logistics. So that's really the majority of the IT investment. And here, I think, is where AI will eventually make a big difference in the long run. But augmented reality still has a place, and I think that's in training. And that's training the factory workers on how to assemble a certain product. You have, what people don't realize is that factory workers don't stay very long in their job. They usually stay a year, and then you have to train new people. So you constantly have a training task. And I think a well-made augmented reality training system for how to assemble a specific product could be kind of cool. But still, you have to realize that the budgets for staff and staff training is very small. And so the factory workers, even though they get paid more and more, is still quite cheap teachers in comparison to an augmented reality system. So I think it will take a while, for the reason that it's already quite cheap with the teachers, and because the factory owners are quite conservative.
Thank Rasmus. A lot of great content and interesting point of views. I think you are a great example of entrepreneur that knows how to pivot your business and see opportunities. And most importantly, take action, right? So during those challenging moments, you were able to pivot your startups, create a new business. And as you said, you're now managing 2 innovative businesses on the same time. So good luck on that. And my last question to you would be, what's your advice to the future hackers out there?
Thank you for those kind words. My advice is that you need to, there's so much advice I want to give. But I think one is to learn to both pivot and stay focused at the same time. Because you constantly get advice from people like, you should focus, don't pivot, because I don't use the word pivot, but they say you need to focus and do the same thing. But that's idiotic, because when you start a company, you don't know anything. Really, what do you know in comparison to what you know a couple of years later? Then you're an expert on it. So of course you're better positioned then to decide what your company should do than to day one. So that idea to just stay on the same track and no matter what is dumb. On the other hand, you need to stay focused. What is the difference then? Well, I guess I think of it as sailing. I used to sail a bit, and sailing has basically two components to it, I guess you could say. One is like, where are we going? What direction are we going? The other is like, keep the boat trimmed and as efficient as possible, especially if you race, right? You need to be really, really do every single thing really well. And that is, I think, is the focus. The focus should be to run your company, every aspect of it, as well as you can. Don't like do things sloppy, because it will just snowball and become and hurt the entire company. So do the little things well. That's the same thing in sailing. On the other hand, you need to keep a direction. So you're kind of in an uncharted territory in my sailing analogy here. So we're kind of Christopher Columbus, right? You're going to go west to find a new path to India. That's your startup, right? So you keep the boat and try and really, really focus on sailing perfectly well. However, when you finally get to India, and it turns out it's not India, it's something else, this now is when you should pivot. Now, if you're Columbus, who wasn't very good at pivoting, the first thing he did was like, well, I'm just going to call you guys Indians anyway. And people still to this day do that. And then he went back to who was his investor and said, sorry, I didn't find India. And then someone else, Amerigo Vespucci, who was more of an entrepreneur, I guess, in my world, he's like, oh, well, I'm going to make the best of the situation. Thank you for paving the way to America. And that's now the continent's name, America, from Amerigo Vespucci. So I think my fragile analogy here, I would say my advice is to don't be Christopher Columbus, be like Amerigo Vespucci.
I love that. That was the best explanation. Rasmus, thank you so much for being with us today. You know, I'm sure that in a couple of months, you're going to have all those amazing news. So the door is open. I hope that in the future, you can come back here and tell about all those different and crazy and innovative ideas that you're putting into practice.
Great. Thank you. It was fun.
Future Hacker. Life. Path. Future.